just a little bit more time to introduce our speaker. Lydia Bangura is a lifelong music performer with experience in studying viola and voice. She holds a bachelor's degree from Northern Arizona University and master's degree from the Chicago College of Performing Arts at Roosevelt University, and is currently enrolled at the University of Michigan studying music theory. She has recently launched a podcast series titled The Theory Club, a music theory and musicology podcast, co-hosted by fellow CCPA student Emily Swijak. Please remember to stay muted during the initial talk portion unless directed to speak. Once the talk is over, questions will be accepted either by unmuting or sending responses to the chat. Lydia's talk today is entitled The Intersection of Academia and Activism. Please put your hands together and ready your clapping emojis, and welcome Lydia. Take it away.
Thank you so much, TJ, and thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to MMRC for allowing me to come and speak. This is a really big topic. I'm intimidated. I look back on past Lydia and I'm like, you could have picked like a symphony or something. I don't know. This is, it's quite a meaty topic, but always important for us to talk about. So I want to begin kind of with recounting an experience that I've had in music theory already. I've just, as TJ mentioned, just started my doctoral studies at the University of Michigan in music theory, and over the past year, I kind of was starting to get into music theory during my last year at Roosevelt. And actually, the story kind of begins with MMRC because I'm going to talk about the conference that we did in. So MMRC, put on this amazing conference back in March. It was a virtual conference. It was my first time kind of presenting a paper about music theoretical ideas, and I was talking about Florence Price and William Dawson and the cultural appropriation of their music. It was a really great conference. I think all the YouTube presentations are still up, so if you're interested in checking those out, they're very cool. Plugs. But it was a really, really great time. I'm glad I got to do it. And that was kind of the first time, I don't know if this has happened to me previous to that event, but that was the first time that I noticed and can remember somebody referring to me as an activist and my work as activism. And in the moment, I startled and was like, oh my goodness. I was, quite surprised that someone would refer to me as like a scholar activist. And ever since then, I've kind of noticed, oh, that person just referred to me as an activist, and that person, and I'm like, oh, suddenly all of my professors are referring to me and my work as activism and all this stuff. And I just kept thinking, is it because I'm a Black person who's interested in researching Black music? Like, that does not make me an activist, right? I've never self-proclaimed to be an activist. So, it became apparent to me it was this label that people were attaching to me because of a Black woman. Like, I really don't understand where it's coming from. So I started to kind of have this fascination with activism from an objective standpoint, but not from the standpoint of like, oh, because I want to be an activist. I feel quite intimidated by that term. I don't want to co-opt the experience of actual activists who are like organizing and things like that, right? When I think of activism, I have like a very vivid image of like a solo martyr, right, who is like suffering publicly in these really public and dramatic ways. Yeah, and who like, gets arrested and all these things and ran down in the street. And that's not what I do, right? Like, I do research. I do teaching. So it felt confusing to me, and I was struggling to understand. And it all kind of culminated around, so SMT, the Society for Music Theory, has their conference coming up annually in November, and they had this lightning talk. There's an interest group that is doing a lightning talk, and it is around the intersection of academia and activism. And when I tell you that every professor and their mom sent me this call and were like, you need to apply for this thing. I bet they would love to have you. You should speak at this thing. And I was like, oh, like, I don't understand. I don't understand why me, right? And so it came to a head when I got connected to actually somebody who is in that interest group and who's partially responsible for picking who gets to do the lightning talks. And this person began to, I'm trying to find the right word, badger me weekly about applying to speak at this thing. And I, first of all, let's talk about the call, right? The call was not, so the way that the call for the talk was structured, it was really frustrating because it's asking these really general questions. Anybody could apply to do it. You don't have to be a music theorist to get picked to do it. Anybody could apply to speak for a 5-minute lightning talk about activism. Now, first of all, 5 minutes? It's insulting at that point. Second of all, the way that the call was structured, it was very like, how does your teaching function as activism? And how have you changed your syllabi? And how have you, right? These very kind of aesthetic, surface level approaches to DEI, to diversity, equity, inclusion. And it's not, it was making the broad assumption, right, that anybody can be an activist and that everybody is equally equipped to be an activist and participate in this kind of work. And I take issue with that, right? I think there's a different conversation to be had there. So just the way that the whole talk was framed, I just didn't like it. I wasn't into it. So the fact that this person really kept imploring me, like, but we really want you to come and do it. I finally talked to that person and had a meeting with them and said, these are all the issues that I have with this talk. It just doesn't really feel conducive to conversations that maybe we really need to have. And, here are all my things that maybe I would change. And I feel really uncomfortable with the whole thing. And that person said, I hear you. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's exactly why you should come and do the talk, because all your critiques are so valid and you are supposed to come in there and roast everybody and read everybody and like tear the whole thing down. Like, we need your, we want to champion Black women. We want to uplift your voice as a Black theorist. Like, we do need you to come in and like yell at everybody, is what this person literally said to me. And I was like, so what that person was saying is, it was kind of clear to me that that person was really struggling with their own sense of white guilt and needed me to absolve them, right? To like come into that room and to like punish them almost for whatever internal conflicts that they were having, and that I was supposed to come in and like make everybody feel better, I guess, by critiquing the situation rather than that person taking my critiques of the situation seriously and maybe taking that into account and back to the interest group that's responsible for the talk. So it was just, I was like, I gotta go. And, that this was all kind of happening as, TJ reached out to me and said, do you want to come speak at our lunch lecture series? And I was like, yes, I need to talk about activism because I'm not going to do it there. So I need a place to do it. So basically, yeah, I tell that story to kind of prompt, like, ever since then, I've really been thinking about what type of work are we actually talking about, right? What are we talking about when we say activism, when we say decolonization? Those are terms being thrown around a lot in like every DEI meeting. Like, what are we actually talking about? Who is equipped to do that work? Who are we forcing into that work? Who do we expect to do that work? And like, what's going on there? So yeah, I thought that I would kind of reference a book that I read for this talk, which is A Third University is Possible by L.A. Paperson. And this book is really, really interesting in the ways that it frames activism and decolonization and those terms, this type of work who is responsible for that type of work and how it actually needs to operate. It's a really interesting book. I would really recommend it. It's like a tiny book, so it's less than 100 pages, but it's already such a small book. It'll probably take you like 90 minutes to read. So I would really recommend it. It's not an unproblematic text, right? But it doesn't claim to be. And I think that it just serves the purpose of being a really good jumping off point for conversations about deconstruction and decolonization. So let me share my screen, and then we're just going to talk a bit about the ideas presented in the book. Great. Can we see this? Okay. Awesome. Let's see if I can. Okay, perfect. We're still seeing this? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, let's get into talking about this book. And we're just gonna talk about a few key points in it. So the text objectives, right? Chapter 1 really goes over understanding the specific technologies of colonialism, right? Because we can't begin to have conversations about decolonization if we don't fundamentally understand how colonialism works and is currently happening, right? Often we talk about colonialism as like an event, right? A thing that happened and we're experiencing the fallout of like an event versus something that happened and is currently happening, will continue to evolve as we evolve, right? Chapter 2 talks about the origins of the university to land as capital, right? And when we talk about land, we're not just talking about physical land, we're also talking about the people groups on those lands, right? We're talking about the resources of those lands, the animals, the water, all those things. So that's a really meaty chapter. We're not really gonna get into it. Read the book. But it's a really great point in the book. Then chapter 3 digs into the concept of the cyborg within the third university. So we're going to define those terms later on. So first, let's talk about, again, this idea of colonial technologies and that they're always evolving and changing, and that through understanding those technologies, right, that's only when we can begin to talk about decolonization, right? Because once we understand how something is constructed, we can deconstruct it. So the author of this book, who uses L.A. Paperson as like an avatar, an alias, talks about the settler, native, slave triad, right? So the settler as the person who feels empowered, entitled, right, to explore on behalf of their own flourishing and the flourishing of their descendants, right, to go out, explore, and take over whatever they want, at the expense of the land that's there, at the expense of Mother Nature, and at the expense of all the people that are there when the settler arrives on the scene, right? The native as the land and the people group who are there when the settler arrives and who the settler seeks to extinguish, right? Seeks to erase. And then the slave, right? The enslaved person as the tool through which the settler maintains their status, right? So they're going to be the people group who serve the ultimate purpose of being fungible, right? Moldable for the settler's purposes. And that purpose, like what the slave does and how the slave interacts with the settler, changes over time, evolves to keep this triad intact, right? So it's important to note about this dynamic, that it's not about specific like ethnic groups or racialized groups, right? It certainly can be. Obviously, white supremacy is a thing, right? It certainly can be, but not always, meaning that you could be at the intersection of more than one, right? It kind of begs the question, are African Americans settlers, right, in America? There are things to talk about there. So it's a lot more nuanced than just like, if you're white, you're automatically a settler. There are things to talk about there. also, yeah, to note in this chapter is that technologies, right, are trafficked, they evolve, and they travel, right? So that's why it's important, not necessarily like to not necessarily look at this triad specifically in terms of race, because it's happening all over the world with different people groups, right? Like different dynamics, this happening all over the world, like presently and in the past, right? And then land, not just people, is the biopolitical target, right? So it's not just about conquering a people group, it's also about feeling like you have the right to put a dam in somewhere, right? Feeling like you have the right to clean water or to direct resources, to, like those types of things, right? So a quote from the book, it says, your or our task is to theorize in the break, that is to refuse the master narrative that technology is loyal to the master. So if we can understand these technologies, they are inherently set up, right, to be loyal to the purposes of colonization. And we can deconstruct that and use it perhaps for a different purpose, right? Maybe not fully removed from colonization, but we can maybe do some other things, right? And empower those tools to begin doing other types of work. So yes, now we're gonna get just a bit into, again, this was like a very meaty chapter for me, the relationship of the modern university to land grants, right? So a quote from the book, land grant institutions were legally born in 1862 when Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act into law. 7 Southern states ceded from the Union and thus removed from Congress the dissenting votes that had previously blocked the Morrill Law Act from becoming law. The act gave federal public lands to Union states, allotting 30,000 acres of recently appropriated land, indigenous lands for each senator and representative to stake out. States were encouraged to sell these land grants to raise money for new public universities that would research and educate American settlers in agriculture, science, and mechanical arts, right? So what's happening here is that the settler, right, feels entitled to educate other settlers, other American settlers in agriculture, science, mechanical arts, right? We're going to need the doctors, we're going to need the lawyers, the engineers, right? To what? To further their flourishing, to further colonization, right? So that from the beginning, from the fact that all of these lands were, you know, appropriated and stolen, to the fact that they were stolen for the purposes of continuing to acquire more for the settler and that whole demographic and people group, that just the fact, I think I have it on the next slide. Yes. So there's another quote from the book. The human is all about the idealizations above the flesh and above the land, right? So what it really comes down to when we're talking about colonization, the idea of conquering, right? The foundation of the university, right? And even our conception of the foundations of knowledge, right? The pursuit of knowledge, which is supposed to be the goal of the university. Knowledge to what? Right? What is the purpose of that knowledge, right? It's to create doctors, lawyers, engineers to further colonization. And so we, as students and faculty of the academy, continue to be colonial technologies, right? We ourselves. And it, right, even down to our conceptualization of the pursuit of knowledge, even the ways that we talk about knowledge, that we grasp concepts, that we master material, right? It's giving colonizer energy, right? We know. So this is important to understand, like, how deep the problem goes, because then in light of these things, you can't go and have a talk about how you're going to change your syllabi and how that's going to be such a radical change, because that's not what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about something much deeper, right? That it's ingrained in all of us to function. We're predisposed to be colonial technologies, right? So let's talk about what I think is so interesting about this book, which is these 3 categories of universities. Let me get the name of, that's right. So it's an analogy to Third Cinema, and it's by Glenn Mamura. So that's who L.A. Paperson is kind of going off of and quotes a lot in this book. So there are these three types of universities, and through, again, examining the ways that colonial technologies function in each of these, we can kind of break them down, right, for our purposes, right, for ultimately good and lasting, long-lasting purposes. So first, there's the first university, which is characterized by an ultimate commitment to brand expansion and accumulation of patent, publication, and prestige, right? So this is a university that's, you know, all about look at me and look at our successful alumni, right? So that's the purpose of that university. Here's another quote from the book on page 38. It says, "This ability to turn anybody into a debtor is what fuels the first university towards inclusion. The desires of people, especially global South people, for meaningful education gets attached by a chain drive into the desires of debt. We become educated by becoming indebted," right? So it has this relationship with debt, right? With acquiring debtors for the purposes of wealth and accumulation and expanding colonization, right? And it just doesn't really hide that, right? It's all about the money. Then we have the second university, right? Which is committed to the transformation of society through critique, a pedagogical utopia. So let's talk about this. This is another quote from the book. It says, its hidden curriculum reflects the material conditions of higher education, fees, degrees, expertise, and the presumed emancipatory possibilities of the mind, and reinscribes academic accumulation, right? So that presumed emancipatory possibility for the mind, right? So the second university is all about, like, we need to decolonize our minds and decolonize our syllabi, right? It's all about the freedom of the individual, right? Through knowledge, which, again, knowledge, what even is that, right? Heavily biased, right? And so, like, it heavily, you know, embedded with purposes of, with colonial purposes. So the fact that the second university, right, is doing better than the first, right, that is, it's actually committed to critique, right, notices these problems, but still is concerned with freedom through knowledge for the student, right, and for the individual, right, which is different from collective freedom. It's very different from we're all free, and it's very utopic focused. It's very utopia focused, right? So here's another quote on page 43. It says, "The Second World University is a pedagogical utopia. Its horizons are still total in that its end goal is a utopia that everyone should and can attend," right? So it's about creating this, like, idealistic, you know, version of a university where there's Black people and white people and indigenous people all holding hands and singing Kumbaya with decolonized minds, right? Pause, right? Because if your utopia still has a university in it, hello, right? Like, what are you doing? So unfortunately, right, it's not worth talking about what a utopia would look like, because every imagined possibility for a utopia that we could have as colonial technologies ourselves is still going to have a bit of colonization in it. So, like, it's just not worth talking about what an idealized version of a school would look like. And I can't wait to look forward to the day that we XYZ. It's not getting us anywhere, right? It's nice to talk about. It makes us feel good, and it doesn't actually do anything long term, right? So now let's get into the third university. This quote from page 44 says, "By necessity, the Third World University teaches first world curricula," right? Because we have to, right? We have to have doctors, we have to have waste management, we have to have engineers, we have to have architects, we have to, right? Like, yeah. And then it teaches a second world critique, because only through critique can the colonial code be cracked, right? So yes, we still need the critique, right? So the parts of the first university and the second university are going to be within the third university because we need them, right? We need critique to get through to the third world, through the third university, right, to the actual work, right? As a strategic reassemblage of first world parts, it is not a decolonized university, but a decolonizing one. But it still produces, it probably still charges fees and grants degrees, right? So here's the thing to understand about the third university. It's not utopic, right? It's not perfect because it's still like charges fees for people to go there, right? And to access this type of thinking and this type of critique, right? So it's not going to be perfectly unproblematic. But it's important to recognize that it's not going to be, I think a lot of times when we think about the work of activism, we picture like a building and like an angry mob coming at it and like tearing it down, right? That we're on the outside and that we come in and we tear it down. When in reality, it's not that we as individuals or even as collectives, right, or even as university units can tear down the university system. Because of the way that the technologies have developed, and because the triad, right, the settler native slave triad is so carefully put in place, the only thing that's going to bring down those structures are the structures themselves. And so then what that prompts us to do is kind of rearrange what we have in the university as it stands, to do colonizing work for us, if that makes sense. So again, a couple kind of quick facts about the third university. It already exists. It is assembling. It assembles within the first and second universities, right? So it's not completely separate from them. It really can't be, but it's kind of made up of their parts, and it's still distinct from them. It is timely, yet its usefulness constantly expires, right? So we need it, and it also needs to be evolving because colonization is always evolving, right? It's vocational in the way of the first world university. It is problematic. In all likelihood, it charges fees and grants degrees. It is anti-utopian, right? A third university is less interested in decolonizing the university and more in operating as a decolonizing university, right? So a university where the system itself begins to do work other than colonization, right? Here's another quote kind of about this whole idea. A decolonizing university is not just about decolonizing the representational work of knowledge production that we associate with universities, nor about decolonizing the treatment of currently enrolled students in its courses of study, right? This is so important, that it's not just about making the experience of enrolled students, right, of students of color, of women and non-binary folks on campus better, right? It's not just about that, because even that is too short term, right? Thinking about the day-to-day of making sure that like women aren't harassed on campus, right? The Black students aren't harassed on campus. Yes, is important, but still incredibly short term, and doesn't do that. That's not taking us all the way to decolonization, right? It's not about decolonizing our syllabi, making sure that Black students have a Black professor to look up to. It's way deeper than that, right? What can we do with this hulking mass of ruins, conduit, fibroids, workhouses, and research facilities built on Indigenous land? What would it take for universities to rematriculate land? What would it take for universities to clean water? What would it mean for universities to counteract war making? What would it mean to hotwire the university for decolonizing work? So let's talk about us and how we fit into this. So this is kind of the last thing that I want to talk about. And it's the role of the cyborg. So Ellie Paperson kind of comes up with this word, adds the S to it to kind of try and differentiate it from like just a regular robot, right? It's kind of a robot with a little bit of agency, right? With a little bit of awareness, right? So they define it as the structural agency of persons who have picked up colonial technologies and reassembled them to decolonizing purposes, right? So it's kind of this you're kind of this human like robot hybrid, right? And it's important to note that cyborg is not an identity, rather a technological fact, right? The cyborg is machined person, technologically enhanced by legitimated knowledge and stamped with the university's brand, right? So we as scholars in the academy have the university's approval, right, through degrees and are set up, right, by default, right, programmed, if you will, by default to further colonization, right, to not question the university system as it stands, because you're supposed to be successful in the university and prove that the university system works and that there is no critique to be had, right? But we know that that's not quite true. So then the book also says the cyborg's medium is assemblage. She knows here broomstick can't carry here beyond colonization, but with it, she might rake together a decolonizing golem, right? So again, it's not about personal, it's not about like decolonizing the individual, right? That really does nothing. It's not about decolonizing our students' minds or our classrooms. And that's just the wrong way to think about it, because you can't read enough to like escape the legacy and impact of colonization, right? Can you even read enough to never be a colonizer yourself, right? No, it's not really something that any of us can escape, right? The second university, right, will tell you that like just by like reading and knowledge, like we're all gonna get to this really utopic version of the university, right? And that knowledge is the way that we do that. You know, we can't fly out of the realm of colonization, but we can begin to almost perform like a witchcraft of sorts, like with our tools equipped to us by the university, right? We can kind of hotwire the university itself to begin to break down itself, right? Because again, at this point, the only thing that's going to bring down these larger structures are the structures themselves. It's only going to come down if they self-destruct. And who programs it to self-destruct? The cyborg does. So I'm just going to leave you with this last quote, and then we can talk about this. And I have some questions and things that we can think about. But on page 56, it says, the cyborg is the perfect masculine expression of education, an autonomous individual who will reproduce the logics of the university without being told. The cyborg is the university's colonial hope. Cyborgs are creatures of colonial desire. Please be successful, be pretty, be human. The cyborg's privilege is a manifestation of the first world university's noblesse prestige. Thus, a successful cyborg proves that the university is ethical, right? So if we have successful alumni, successful alumni, then there's like nothing to contend with, right? Because the alumni are happy, they're successful, they're beautiful, they're making it, they write great books, and they do great scholarship, and they teach amazing classes, and there's nothing to question. However, on the flip side, the cyborg is a source of colonial anxiety. Please do not fail us, reject us, betray us. The cyborg has here desires too. Hers is a decolonial hope. She is never a completely loyal colonialist and can often be caught in the basement library building the third university. So I believe that's all I have for my PowerPoint. I have kind of some things for us to question about all those things. I know I feel like every time I do a presentation, it's just me reading a whole book. Like I just read a million quotes and I'm like, there you go. So, you know, obviously LA Paperson really did the work and I just read the book. So read the book. But, you know, also I promise I'm a musician and I am going to connect this to being a musician at some point. So I have some questions for y'all, and, you know, we can kind of discuss the ideas put forth in the book. I think are just really interesting. But for me, kind of the biggest thing that I like about this book is I find the language really helpful, right? The language of the cyborg, the language of the third university. I find that so much more helpful than the language of activism. And that might be some personal bias, right? Because I'm, you know, now I have this association with activism of like it being this really dramatic like martyr situation where you're getting shot by the police, and that's also a very real experience for being Black. So like I just have beef with that term, and beef when people ascribe it to me without me doing so in the first place. But I find the language of the cyborg. There's another. Again, I'm just reading a whole book to you. You should really read this book. It's good. There's like one other quote about the language. Here it is. So it says, you are not just a cyborg. There are other ways to analyze your agency. You could be also a monster, an orphan, a ghost. You might jump scale. You might cut and break. Your cyborg agency does not preclude the other choices that you have. In whatever case, you are a disturbance in the electromagnetic field. I see your shimmering outline. Right? So not even hanging on the word cyborg, but it's making this claim that you are fashioned to be a colonial technology, and that's not all you are, right? You are empowered. You're like a mystical being that does colonizing work, right? The university kind of only does colonizing work, but also not, right? Also, you're capable of doing something else. And the university is terrified of you realizing that and enacting that agency that you have, right? So, and again, being real about how much agency that actually is, right? Like not getting hung up on like that we're going to be that angry mob that can come in and just like tear it down in one fell swoop, right? Again, treating colonization and also decolonization as an event. It's not an event, right? It's not a thing that's going to like just like happen one day. It's it's a series of events in which these systems begin to fall themselves, right? At this point, that's how that's going to go down. And we as kind of these like mystical beings, right, hotwire the university, program the university, reassemble the university. I find those really helpful terms for what this work actually is versus the work of activism, which feels so like daunting and big and like I have to do it alone, like I have to be a martyr, right? So what I want to know from y'all is, do you also find this language helpful? Are there other terms that you think of when you think of this type of work? Like, is it just me that's nervous? I don't know. When it comes to activism, again, that might be a bias thing. I don't know if that's like, yeah, but and again, going back to the idea of whose job is it to participate in this work, right? Like who's best equipped to participate in this work? Is it solely Black and Indigenous folks, or is it, right? Like, so asking through those questions, who do we quote unquote expect to do this work, right? And in trying to champion and uplift people of color right, for the purposes of aesthetics. So yes, a few other questions. I'm just going to throw out a bunch of stuff and then we can talk about whatever, even if it's not related to any of these questions. Any thoughts that you have? I really just, this is what I wanted SMT to be. This is what I wanted the talk to be, is talking about these kinds of ideas. So kind of, let's see, tying it to music now, as far as like, can we recognize some colonial technologies of music specifically, right? Of music studies, of music scholarship, right? So some of the things coming to mind, right? The concept of genius, right? The concept of the way that the canon has formed, right? And why is the canon not more diverse? Well, if Black people were writing music and Black people were good at composing, they'd be in the canon. Like, you know, this idea that you can just kind of like ascend, like transcend being in a Black body and just like ascend into the canon because there's a spot for you. And if you didn't get in, it's because there wasn't actually a spot for you because you weren't that good, Florence Price. So, you know, those ideas, right? Those are harmful ideas. Or like the citational chain, right? So that there's a white male music theorist who cites a white male music theorist who only cites other white male music theorists, right? So the ways that people are cut out of scholarship, right? Those are evolving colonial technologies, right, that we're dealing with in the present. So if we can think of other music related kind of technologies that are happening now. That was a lot. I just talked so much. Okay, so that's it for me. Thank